On March 11, 2011, half of Japan was trembling from powerful, long-lasting tremors along the country's northeastern coast. The Great East Japan earthquake became the strongest earthquake ever recorded in Japan and the fourth most powerful in the world since records began in 1900. Right after the tremors, a massive tsunami slammed into the northeast coast of Tohoku, taking nearly 20,000 lives. Another 2,500 people went missing. The tsunami swallowed up 16 cities, 95,000 buildings, 23 train stations, hundreds of miles of roads, railroad tracks, and seawalls. Over 60,000 acres of farmland ended up covered in debris washed in by the wave. You'd think Japan would have been ready for something like this, but the old seawalls built along the coastline couldn't provide proper protection. After the tsunami, the area was left deserted. People didn't move back to where so many had died, but the area found a new purpose. Where houses once stood, Japan has built something capable of preventing future catastrophes, something that will keep the ocean from reaching the shore again. Well, almost. Let me take a sip of coffee and we'll carry on. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do something. And thanks, you know what for. Let's start, perhaps, with the town of Taro in Iwate Prefecture. It's a small settlement where locals rely heavily on the sea, and like many other fishing villages, it lives under the constant threat of tsunamis. Strolling through the hills surrounding Taro, you'll spot small Shinto shrines scattered here and there, marking how far the waves reached in the past, unless, of course, the shrine was swept away. Throughout its history, Taro's been hit by tsunamis 4 times. To protect the town, a double seawall was built in an X-shaped design. This seawall became famous worldwide as the perfect example of man-made tsunami defenses. It stretched for 1.5 miles and stood 33 feet tall, known as the Banri no Chojo. The local government regularly held yearly drills simulating a tsunami emergency. During these drills, volunteers would shut the gates of the seawall while residents headed to gathering points above the town. The system worked well when the tsunami caused by the 1960 Valdivia earthquake in Chile hit Japan. Not a single person in Taro died. Back in 2003, the city declared itself the disaster prevention town and even put up a whole monument to mark it. Taro was famous across the country for its skill in dealing with tsunamis, and they even taught kids how to handle it. But in 2011, everything changed. A tsunami that was 39 to 49 feet high simply swept away part of the wall, ripping off 1,600-foot chunks from it. Confident in the protection the wall provided, some people in Taro climbed up the wall to watch the approaching wave. 181 people died or went missing. Not everything was that bad in 2011. For example, the 3,000 residents of the village of Fudai owe their lives to a 49-foot wall, which was considered a waste of money when it was built in the 1980s at the mayor's insistence, but that was more of an exception. Most of the seawalls didn't provide enough protection against the tsunami in March 2011. In this video, you can see how the waves in Kamaishi City simply broke through the city's seawall, which at the time was the biggest in the world. The concrete barriers barely put up a fight and might have even contributed to the death toll, killing people who had let their guard down thinking they were safe. And here's one important thing to mention: all these seawalls could potentially save lives, but only if the tsunami doesn't exceed the expected height and pressure. Basically, it can't be stronger than the engineers made it. The problem is that you can't predict how high the next tsunami will be, which means no one's safe. But are there any other options besides walls? I mean, let's see how areas change after disasters. It's clear that they're rebuilt, but it happens in a peculiar way. If you look at the cities being rebuilt after the tsunami, you can notice that where the houses used to be, there's nothing now. This happens because some of them literally move inland, further away from the ocean. Some cities are being rebuilt as far away from the water as possible. In others, like Onagawa in Miyagi Prefecture, new homes, offices, and schools are being built on a series of artificial plateaus, huge flat hills scattered across the coastal plain. These hills are meant to become islands and save people in case of a flood. Overall, about 40% of at-risk municipalities have already moved or are planning to move further away or higher up. A survey by the Asahi Shimbun newspaper showed that 62 out of 139 cities, towns, and villages located in high-risk earthquake zones have already relocated public facilities like local government offices, fire stations, schools, and hospitals, or they're planning to do so. The logic here is pretty clear. Back in 2011, when the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami devastated the Tohoku region in the northeast, many local government buildings got flooded. They couldn't be used as command centers for disaster response anymore, and it's just impossible to deal with natural disasters without those kinds of hubs. This experience prompted the federal government to recommend moving such buildings out of high-risk areas, and people got to work. Japan often relocates things to higher ground. For instance, in April 2024, the country moved dozens of F-15J fighters because of a tsunami threat, a very smart move, but must look hilarious to a regular person. Just imagine, you step outside your house in the morning and there goes a fighter jet driving down the road. Another way to protect against natural disasters is to reinforce buildings. There's a saying in seismic engineering, earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do. That's why engineers and urban planners have long been working on ways to shield cities from strong quakes. Builders have all kinds of tricks up their sleeves, from massive shock absorbers that swing like pendulums inside skyscrapers to spring or ball bearing systems that let buildings sway independently of their foundations. Technology keeps evolving, and this process is shaping the way buildings are designed. Here's a building in Osaka that's been reinforced to withstand earthquakes, and this is a seismic isolation system on a column head at Shimizu Corporation's Engineering Research Center in Tokyo. Even this is an earthquake-resistant column. It's just old. It was used in the design of an old wooden house in Miyama, Kyoto Prefecture. Yeah, it looks like just a piece of wood, but it does the job. How about something more recent, like tying a building to the ground? In 2016, the textile company Komatsu Matere and architect Kengo Kuma attached their headquarters building to the ground, literally anchored it like a tent. This fastening was the first ever seismic-resistant reinforcing structure in the world using carbon fiber. To be more precise, it used a thermoplastic composite rod made of carbon fiber. The whole setup works like a tent. When one part of the building tilts, the cables on the other part tighten, keeping the whole structure in place. In the end, even if the earthquake is strong, the cables help reduce the shaking inside the building and also help prevent it from collapsing. Japan isn't just waiting for potential disasters, it's preparing for them. Well, for one specific, truly horrible, destructive earthquake that's supposed to happen pretty soon. When in August 2024, some areas in western Japan felt seismic activity, local and national authorities immediately started taking action. However, in the end, the government canceled most of the warnings and didn't report any serious damage from the 7.1 magnitude earthquake. But despite that, most of the country remains on high alert for a new emergency, and it seems that this alert is not without reason. A mega earthquake is looming on the Nankai Trough, and it'll be the most powerful of its kind. Its magnitude could exceed 9.0. Seismologists say a mega earthquake could happen within the next few decades, although the scientific data is still up for debate. But what's this mega thrust all about? And why should we expect trouble from it? Nankai is a subduction zone, meaning it's a place where tectonic plates collide and the oceanic crust sinks into the Earth's mantle. The zone stretches over 430 miles, and it's in places like this where the strongest earthquakes tend to happen. 9 out of 10 of the biggest earthquakes in the past 100 years have occurred in subduction zones. These include the Great Chilean Earthquake of 1960, the 2004 Indian Ocean Earthquake, and the Great East Japan Earthquake of 2011. Strong earthquakes in the Nankai Trough happen every 100 to 200 years. The most recent ones were in 1944 and 1946, both with a magnitude of 8.1. They wiped out large parts of Japan, leaving at least 2,500 dead. However, the Japanese government has made some conclusions after calculating the intervals in between megathrust earthquakes, and the outlook is grim. If things continue as they have, there's a 70 to 80% likelihood that within 30 years, Japan will experience another powerful earthquake in the Nankai Trough. Although this information seems to be well known, 30% of the residential areas built after the 2011 tsunami are currently in a flood zone. In such a situation, we need a really cool solution. One of the biggest projects underway right now is a massive seawall and wave barrier already being called the Great Japanese Wall, stretching 246 miles from the northern Iwate Prefecture to the southern Fukushima Prefecture and reaching 51 feet at its highest points. The Great Wall has become a literal concrete link between these prefectures and their shared memories of the 2011 disaster. The cost of this monumental project is expected to reach about $12.74 billion by the time it's finished. And if you think this is just a huge thing, something that blows your mind, well, you're not mistaken. The scale of the project is mind-blowing, even in a country where most of the coastline is already protected from storms and erosion by concrete walls. But the Great Japanese Wall isn't just taller than its predecessors. Its new design includes wider foundations and reinforced inner walls to prevent collapse and better absorb the force of multiple waves. The height was also adjusted based on forecasts and the impact of mega earthquakes. From the grim experience of 2011, other lessons were learned. They improved the warning systems, did computer modeling to create evacuation route maps. In short, they got prepared. The key factor in creating the barrier was understanding that not all tsunamis are the same. Level 1 tsunamis occur every 50 to 60 or 150 to 160 years, and regular seawalls, of which Japan has many, are meant to protect against them. But for Level 2 tsunamis, which can happen every few hundred or even a few thousand years, just the old seawalls aren't enough. Before the 2011 tsunami, most of the seawalls along the coast were 6.5 to 13 feet tall, and some parts of the coastline had no barriers at all. The idea behind building the Great Japanese Wall is not just to provide protection that'll stop tsunamis, but also to slow down the inevitable arrival of a bigger wave, to delay the disaster by a few precious seconds or minutes in case of a major tsunami. The artificial barrier is meant to dissipate and break the force of the waves. And this is really important. It's believed that in 2011, many people could have survived if they'd been given just 1 or 2 extra minutes to escape. Maybe you're wondering, so is there anything else to do besides building walls and all those alerts? Can we somehow stop a tsunami? Unfortunately, other than building really high walls around vulnerable coastlines, there's not much that can be done to physically protect from the forces of nature. At least humanity hasn't come up with anything yet. But you know what's interesting? Although the new Big Wall project will undoubtedly help protect the coastal population from future tsunami threats, it turns out that the wall itself isn't exactly popular with everyone. The vast majority of coastal towns, meaning their residents, voted for the construction of the wall, but there are those who oppose it.
海と一緒に見ながらずっと子供の頃から来たっていうのがあって、普段うちからでもどっからでも。
Of course, they understand that the wall will protect them if something like the 2011 tsunami happens again, but at the same time, people are afraid that it'll also break their bond to the sea. For generations, the people in coastal towns have not only made a living off the sea, but also found their sense of identity in it. They're used to seeing the water from their windows, and they feel empty without it. For some people, walls are just an eyesore. In some areas, the height of the barriers reaches 4 stories, which means they block everything and make people feel like they're in prison. Others worry that the walls will scare tourists and deprive the locals of their livelihood. But there's another argument, more important than the usual view and connection to the sea. In the event of another major earthquake, people just won't be able to notice changes in the sea's behavior or the signs of draining that signal a tsunami, which means they won't be able to prepare in time. There's also an opinion that ultra-high seawalls could actually make the effects of a tsunami worse, creating a barrier like a dam. A dam protects as long as it stays intact. If the new big wall can't withstand the force of the tsunami, the flood that crashes into the houses will be even stronger. In the village of Akahama, fisherman Haromi Kawaguchi managed to turn most people against the construction of a giant wall. Even though he lost his wife, mother, and grandson in the 2011 tsunami, the man doesn't believe the new wall will protect locals if another big wave hits. He says in the last tsunami, the old wall was destroyed, and its remains were left floating on the surface like cubes of tofu. Everything man-made is destined to be destroyed. It's inevitable. Another argument against the wall is that it creates a false sense of security. Thinking they're safe, people will delay evacuation and could end up dying. Plus, some people believe that the $17 billion spent on building the wall could have been used more effectively. For example, that money could have been spent on relocating communities to safer areas. Activists figured that it would take Japanese taxpayers 25 years to cover the cost of building the seawall. One village even managed to stop the construction. This happened on Oshima, the largest inhabited island in the Tohoku region. Known as the Green Pearl for its natural beauty and charm, the island has a thriving community, and they were far from happy about the decision to build a dam here. The islanders were mostly skeptical about the idea of a great wall to protect against tsunamis. They convinced the prefecture to cancel the 39-foot-high wall planned for one of the beaches and build a wooden promenade instead of a barrier at the neighboring one. They did build the sea dam after all, but a bit lower than originally planned and on the locals' terms. When it comes to the sentiment of the coastal area population, that's all pretty clear. But what do ecologists think about the massive wall? Well, they're not thrilled. The wall could mess with not just the coastal environment, but also block the interaction between the sea and the beach. It'll affect sediment transport and coastal erosion, and the movement of water currents, and nutrient flow, and biodiversity, obviously. Wild animals that usually visit the beach at night won't be able to get there anymore. That's going to impact their behavior and long-term survival. Then you get population decline, extinction risks, the usual story. Movable seawall. So as you can see, Japan does a lot to protect itself from tsunamis. And here's another unique invention, a movable sea dam. The system includes gates placed at the entrance of a port, which close during periods when the port is not active, like at night or on holidays. When the gates lift, the difference in water levels inside and outside the port helps generate electricity. This energy is stored and used for future gate operations. All in all, it's a really cool thing, multifunctional. Researchers from the Tokyo Institute of Technology came up with the idea for such a seawall, and this project will be especially promising for areas prone to tsunamis caused by earthquakes along the Nankai Trough. Additionally, the system could generate excess energy, providing emergency power to ports in case of outages. And power outages, that's something that happens a lot during natural disasters. To give you an idea of how useful such a dam would be, let me tell you that Japan has 2,780 fishing ports and 993 commercial and industrial ports. And all of them need protection from natural disasters. The problem is each port will need its own dam, and that's a huge investment. It's interesting that as of today, there are no systems in the world that use movable seawalls to generate electricity and then use that energy to power themselves. In other words, the Japanese have invented something completely new. All that's left is to get it up and running. Wreckage Journey. After the devastating earthquake in March 2011 on Japan's northeastern coast, which caused the infamous tsunami and killed about 20,000 people, the waves swept some buildings into the ocean. It was a horrible tragedy for the people of Japan, and another proof of that is the wreckage of houses that traveled about 4,000 miles across the northern part of the Pacific Ocean over 14 months after the event. As a result, the wreckage made it all the way to Alaska, where people in some towns started noticing and collecting plastic bottles, pieces of foam, and floating buoys that had washed ashore from Japan. Other items were spotted along the coast of Canada. They even found a whole motorcycle. There was so much debris that it was estimated to weigh 1.5 million tons. Of course, gathering all of it at once was almost impossible, and it took years to pick up what was left of the Japanese houses. And yes, in all that junk in the Pacific, you could find literally anything, from fridges to construction materials and soccer balls. A memorable tree. On March 11, 2011, a disaster struck the city of Rikuzen Takata. Like in many other places, the city was hit by waves up to 43 feet high. As a result of the tragedy, about 1,700 people died, and only a few buildings in the city center survived. One unique tree, known as the Miracle Pine, managed to survive the disaster. As the mayor of the city said, the pine became a source of strength and hope for life to go on. In 2013, the pine tree was open to visitors, not in the sense that it was being protected and hidden from people, but because it needed some restoration. A metal frame was inserted into the trunk of the 250-year-old tree, which had grown to 89 feet tall, and they added artificial branches and leaves made of synthetic resin. When the internet started criticizing the supposed cost of this project, the city decided to raise funds through donations both in Japan and abroad. The goal of 150 million yen was easily reached, which is almost $1 million. In addition to restoring the pine tree, a park dedicated to disaster prevention is planned for the coastal plain, with the ancient tree itself as its central feature. For a year after the tragedy, it was lit up every night in honor of the tsunami victims. Stones are warning. On the northeast coast of Japan, in the village of Anayoshi, stands a 10-foot-high stone tablet with a warning carved into it for the locals. The inscription says, "High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point." It's a little unsettling, but the stone speaks the truth. These tsunami stones are scattered along the Japanese coastline and serve as reminders for people to seek higher ground after earthquakes, which may be followed by destructive waves. Most of these stones date back to around 1896, when two disasters claimed the lives of about 22,000 people. Despite this, for decades, warnings carved into stones were often ignored or forgotten as coastal towns rapidly expanded and people relied more on the sturdy seawalls built by the Japanese authorities. However, in some places like Anayoshi, the locals still followed the instructions left by their ancestors, and not just followed, even children know about these inscriptions because they study them in school. But as I've already said, not everyone is willing to learn from the experiences of previous generations. For example, in Japan, 4 years after the catastrophic tsunami in March 2011, about 230,000 people were still living along the coast. Elevators with toilets. What comes to your mind when you think of elevators? Personally, I think of them as a quick way to get between floors, and a little bit of claustrophobia. However, if the Japanese government follows through with their plans, your idea of elevators could change. The Ministry of Infrastructure of Japan is looking into adding restrooms and water sources for elevators. This change could significantly improve the functionality of elevators, offering more comfort and safety for passengers in emergency situations. And it's not just a proposal for exceptionally tall buildings. The new approach to elevator design could become the norm for multi-story buildings. This is particularly important for countries with high seismic activity, where every little detail is crucial for safety and convenience. You might think it's made so that always busy businessmen don't have to waste time at home and can take care of everything they need right in the elevator. However, the real reason is connected to the constant earthquakes in Japan, especially since in case of a disaster, people often have to wait for rescue for hours or even days. Though if I had an elevator like that in my house, I'd sleep an extra hour and do everything else right there. Just need to add a shower. Oh, and a coffee machine. Finished watching? Hit the like button. See you later.